Compelling stories are not hard to find. You just need to know where to look. Join your hosts, Dr. Eric Shaw, prosecutor Ryan Frank, writer Adrian Bonenberger, and comedian Ryan Connor, as they interview ordinary people about their extraordinary experiences. This is Baggage.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Ryan Frank. Joining us today is a very special guest, Anna Reich, an associate professor of art at Augustana University. She earned a bachelor's from the University of California, Davis, and earned a MFA from Bard College, and has received numerous grants, including a Fulbright Fellowship and a Robert Reichenberg Foundation Artist as Activist Travel Grant. The audience will never know everything I just cut out to get through that. She's joining us today because I will describe it as kind of like a vicarious storytelling, because there is a group of society that rarely ever gets their story told. And Anna is the author of a book called I Try Not to Think of Afghanistan, which I just read, which is brilliant, and a very unique perspective because it's Soviet troops in Afghanistan and all the factors and experiences and really a broad range of different soldiers and their experiences in the Soviet army, specifically Lithuanians. So Anna, I'll let you fill in some of the gaps there, but thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be invited and participate, and I'm really excited to talk about these guys and their experiences.
Let me start with exactly how does one come about being interested in getting stories and collecting stories from Soviet vets?
The journey was definitely not linear. I think I spent about 8 years, no, maybe 4 years in the U.S. working with U.S. veterans, working as a full-time volunteer while I was in grad school at the Boston's Causeway Clinic, which has it's a branch of the VA, and they have a facility called the Psychosocial Rehabilitation and Recovery Center, so the PRRC. And I was kind of supporting medical professionals and clinical professionals that were helping veterans who were suffering from very extreme post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health disorders. And after that experience, which is about 18 months long, I thought, I think it would be really interesting to look at other parts of the world and other people who've experienced war from different sides. And so I was working with Holocaust survivors and Gulag survivors and people who had survived World War II in Eastern Europe. And then after about 6 months of doing that, I thought, there's so many layers of trauma here. And I had kind of been introduced to the Soviet-Afghan War. And I was working in Lithuania, and I thought, this is a really fruitful space where you have all of these complicated dualities of you're the soldier and the hero, but you're also the victim because of the totalitarian regime, and just thinking about their experience as this really layered, complex one. And also thinking about, I then began learning about research that had been done, wanting to compare them with Vietnam War veterans and the complex experience that people who had deployed to Vietnam and then returned to a really rapidly changing U.S. had. And then that's the parallel with these Lithuanians who departed Lithuania when it was part of the Soviet Union and then returned to this on the verge of freedom Lithuania that was going to have independence as the Soviet Union dissolved. So there was all of these interesting parallels, and I thought this deserves my time. I should spend time thinking about this and learning and trying to make space for these people.
And one thing that I immediately found with the book that was interesting is just I from the very beginning viewed the Afghan war with the Soviet Union very differently, because when I was growing up, I'm a child of the 90s, 80s and 90s, and most of what I knew about Russia was from Rambo and Red Dawn, but it's always been compared to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan was their version of Vietnam as it was for the United States. And there's stark differences there because, yes, the veterans that came home from the Vietnam War weren't very welcomed, but over the decades, that's changed considerably. Not so much for Soviet vets. Can you tell us kind of what goes into that and why that's the case?
Sure. Well, and I love that you brought up Rocky and Rambo, because I think that goes both ways. Like, that cuts both ways. A lot of what they know about the US comes from media like that. And so those films were brought up multiple times by multiple people that I was interviewing, or just in like casual conversation. But to get to your question directly, I think I am actually cautiously optimistic that that is beginning to change, that after 20 years, there is beginning to be a desire in these former Soviet nations that are now independent to kind of understand this demographic of people. I spent a portion of May in Lithuania and was kind of heartened in a weird way to have a lot of interest in like their primary and secondary schools in kind of teaching that period of time and understanding that period of time as something that's pivotal to knowing how their nation gained its independence and got to where it is now. However, 10 years ago, when I began this work, the Soviet Army and veterans of the Soviet Army were still very much viewed as people who participated in something that had nothing to do with Lithuania and their national goals, their heritage, their culture. And ultimately they participated in like the occupying force. And so support for people who deployed to Afghanistan, who were conscripted into the Soviet Army and did anything related to the Soviet Army was pretty much non-existent. And it was a little bit taboo to talk about the experiences because of the persisting political beliefs and the persisting kind of skepticism about present day Russian politics. And I had the kind of unique experience of starting this project before the seizure of Crimea and completing it post seizure of Crimea and after kind of the initial invasion of like Donetsk and the eastern region. And so with that as a backdrop, it was all the more sensitive, which I found very interesting. And it also made for a lot of interviews to be kind of a space for people to kind of delicately air their personal perspectives on Russia and Russia's kind of interest and then involvement and then occupation of Ukraine.
Maybe a little bit of a history lesson, because I consider myself a little bit of a history buff, and myself and Adrian are veterans ourselves. But I had to remind myself the Soviet Union and Afghanistan was roughly 79 to 80, 88, 89, somewhere around there, right? So over about a 10-year period, and it was the Soviet-bloc countries, former what are now Soviet-bloc countries, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, those countries being conscripted in, as well as Russians. And I thought it was really interesting, the isolating factor if you're from these different countries, because there wasn't like a Lithuanian regiment, right? I mean, they kind of get all grouped together, and that can be isolating in its own way. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So my knowledge of that is really based mostly on what was described to me. I don't know that there's a ton of easily accessible research on how the demographics of different like troops or different units were actually made up. A lot of what was described to me was that, and this is coming, I like huge asterisks to what I'm saying. These are firsthand accounts that are probably biased, perhaps rightfully so, or perhaps not. But most of what was described to me was that Russians had a lot more authority, Russian soldiers had a lot more authority, and Lithuanians, Latvians, Ukrainians, Tajiks, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, all people like from the Kars, the Central Asian republics, were in like very lowly positions and often treated with an element of prejudice. Again, this reiterating what's been said to me.
Yeah, and I think there's over 20 different vets in the book, and one or more of them, I think, listed that you would have all these different Soviet-bloc countries, and they would be the only Lithuanian, because percentage-wise, there just wasn't that many. And I mean, we think about it of people, Marines come back from Afghanistan, or Army guys come back from Afghanistan, and a lot of them deal with some pretty significant PTSD. But you're there with your buddies, and you went through it. And, I can't imagine the isolating factor of you don't have anybody, you don't even have a shared culture necessarily with the people you're serving with. And you hear stories about some of the atrocities that happened with the Soviet Union on both sides, what the Afghans did to the Soviets and what the Soviets did to them. And it is the stuff of nightmares. How willingly were some of these soldiers willing to share some of that? Because the way it's portrayed in the book, it's within a couple of paragraphs. They're talking about some pretty, I won't say repeated on the podcast, but really grotesque things that humans do to each other.
Yeah, and that's what made the book. There were plenty of stories shared that then were I was asked to maybe not put in writing or not record. I found it really varied by individual, and I did not see a pattern based on a person identifying as someone who experienced PTSD or someone who felt like they had come through their deployment or deployments, which were often 27 months, and been untouched. It seemed pretty random as to who wanted to speak about that sort of thing. And I can't even begin to speculate on what caused that. Everyone got the same set of questions, original set of questions from me. And of course, as people, talked and spilled stories, I would ask further questions. But there was this kind of a foundational beginning for everyone. And none of the questions were tell me something horrible or can you describe your worst experience? I don't think that's a constructive way to interview people.
Right. Yeah, it really struck me because I think a lot of American vets would relate to it depending on what your job was. You could have a very different experience. I was in Iraq and Adrian was in Afghanistan. Apples and oranges are experiences. We've talked about it before. I won't retell the stories now, but you can see a truck driver's experience was, not nearly it was very different from an artilleryman's experience because the truck driver's by the roadside bombs and he's seeing this happen to him and his friends. And it was just very, very interesting to see it from another perspective.
So it sounds like you had history working with veterans before writing this book. Can you talk maybe about the different experiences you had kind of culturally between American vets versus these? Was there anything notably different in the way that people kind of approached their trauma and their experience?
That is a difficult question. It's hard because that is for me to use the analogy, the ultimate apples to oranges experience, because vets of Iraq and Afghanistan are my generation. So it's talking to friends or people who I would hypothetically be friends with or who I would know. My experience with the VA is a clinical setting. So again, very different set of expectations for the person receiving care, for the person speaking about their experience. And then with the Lithuanian veterans, they're aware that there's a possibility that anything they say is going to be published. Many people were recorded, both, using a camera and microphone. And so those are far more formal. I think one of the dynamics that was very interesting and couldn't have happened in any other setting that happened with the Lithuanian veterans is almost every single person wanted to make sure that I understood that it was obviously I was not old enough to be paying taxes at that time, or I wasn't alive, but my parents' tax dollars funded the weapons that were used against them because the U.S. Reagan began funding the Mujahideen. I don't remember what year that was, if it was 84 or 85, but there was a pivotal moment where the U.S. began kind of publicly funding the Mujahideen and efforts against the Soviets. And so it was really important to them that I confirmed that I knew that. And there was an acknowledgement that that, yes, you're correct. And I recognize that your choice to talk to me in some way probably demonstrates an element of forgiveness or something. It was an interesting dynamic that couldn't have happened in any of the other contexts.
That is so layered because you had implied that the country of Lithuania and its citizens, I'm assuming generally are not pro-Russian. They have some scars from their past. Is that accurate, would you say?
I would say so. It's very hard to say with specificity at this point. I would say the majority are not pro-Russian.
Okay, so you got a country that is gained their independence. It's been decades now. They view Russia in a certain light. Then they have these vets that fought for a nation state that doesn't exist anymore, but it's associated with Russia. They wanted you to know how you were, I guess, somewhat of the enemy in the enemy camp, right? But now, hey, we're willing to talk to you. So how does that relate to how they view their own experience? Do they have, or I'm sure it varied, but do they have regret, and do they view themselves in any way like Americans would view the Soviets in Afghanistan? It seems so complicated.
It was incredibly complicated. And, despite my efforts to really try to be prepared and educated in advance, I don't think, unless you're there talking to people and getting kind of the pulse on individuals and then the pulse on a group, that a person can really prepare for the nuances that exist in kind of veterans of the Soviet army that are Lithuanians. And I can't imagine it's any different for people in other post-Soviet nations. But they, many of them, and I'm like very much paraphrasing here, would say things like, even though it was wrong, we still had to do this. And we still, essentially like we still tried really hard and we still experienced something that was deeply traumatic and deeply transformative. And so how to toe the line of acknowledging that and giving that space in a person's life and a person's like independent narrative of themselves, while also acknowledging that like, we did not choose this. Nobody asked us if we wanted to do this. This had nothing to do with our personal beliefs, or if it did, based on the levels of ideological preparation that they experienced once they got out of the Soviet Union and saw the world through different lenses, they realized that that was all false and that was a fantasy, and that, that belief system actually was rooted on nothing concrete. And then again, they're in this space of like, how do we fit this, what was often like a 2-year experience into our personal narrative and understand it with some degree of like continuity and like holistic kind of like sense of how this impacted their lives, and not be depressed about it.
That's one of the reasons I really enjoyed the book. I have my copy right here. Was the decision, which I think was probably intentional on your part, both to kind of anchor each of the profiles with photographs, and also to be very sparing in your framing of the project. It's probably one of the least framed projects I've ever read of the type, where you don't have like lengthy chapters in the beginning and the end. You've got a few pages of an intro, and then you've got a couple pages of epilogue, which just sort of acknowledges that you were doing this when Russia was invading Ukraine, which changed probably the nature of it a little bit from how you'd planned it initially. But most of it is just very human portraits of these people who served. I found that very compelling because it took all at the same time that you had those that context and the layered relationships of Lithuanian veterans of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan being supported by the United States during the Cold War. It's also just, here's this guy Jonas, and he went to war. And here's a young man, Jonas, with his family. And here's an old man, Jonas, who came out of war and has the lines in his face and the experiences to prove it. Yeah, how much of that was you went into the project thinking, not necessarily being sure how you were going to make it, and then you took the photos and said like, this is how it's going to be, and how much of it was working with the material, and how much of it was intentional from day one?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's like an incredibly generous compliment, and I'm really, really glad that that's how you interpreted it, and it came across to you. I would say it's hard to put a percentage down. I don't so I teach, and I say this to people all the time, like every day. I don't like telling people what to do or what to think. And so it was really important to me, as I thought about this as a book, that I wasn't making claims about their experiences or making claims about how and why this did or didn't transform them, or how and why they dealt with this. I'm not a veteran, and it just felt inappropriate for me to make any kind of claim in any way. And so I knew that going in. So there was some intentionality to the lack of framing or specific context, trying to guide a reader that and then everyone, because they had conversations, felt better, or because they didn't get therapy, they drank. I just felt like any kind of generalization would be a disservice to them. And maybe secondly, and it is more of a reactionary decision. There are some people who had really different perspectives. And there were some pro-Russians that I interviewed that didn't want to come across pro-Russian in what was documented, but that were very pro-Russian. And so it felt wrong to remove those people because their insights on the war in Afghanistan were interesting and unique and still important. But I also felt that providing context on perspectives of war would be impossible when there was no consensus. There are people who feel, who had really differing opinions about what's happening in Eastern Europe, and people who had really differing opinions about war in general, their willingness to return to Afghanistan, their willingness to essentially deploy again if asked. And so I didn't feel like there was a consensus that I could give as a type of framework. It just felt wrong.
I have a quick follow-up there because this is sort of, if there's $1 million question when it comes to issues of veterans and combat experience, I don't even want to get into PTSD, but just combat experience. I think that the question boils down to, does combat change you? And if so, does it change you for the better or for the worse? And I think some people would, probably the gross and obscene generalization, the fascist would say that combat is truth and it changes you for the better because it strips away all of the falsities of life, and life is actually just nature, and nature is the law of the tooth and the claw. And the non-fascist, the Democrat or the liberal, would say war is bad and it turns us into savage creatures who are unreasoning, and it debases us and it strips us of our humanity. I think one can see in the veterans one knows, and even in the people who play veterans, cosplay veterans almost on a national stage, like how they're doing it. Am I like a good person who has tried to learn some lesson from this, or am I a bad person who would like to be back in the uniform and oppressing people? I wonder if you, and you don't have to, I'm not trying to put you on the spot here with this, but I guess, do you feel that there's any, can like when you're grouping people into groups of, when you're grouping people into who would go back or who wouldn't go back, or your sense, and this isn't just with this book, with Lithuania, with Lithuanian veterans of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but maybe even American veterans, like, do you feel that you're any closer, having done this book, to being able to make a determination in a sense of saying like, oh, like that doesn't surprise me that person wants to go back to war because X, Y, or Z. And I can say that I would go back to war, and I don't think that I'm a fascist at all. So it's not just a question of going back to war, but like the way they relate to it, the way that there's like a sadistic gleam in their eye when they're telling you some sort of horrible story or something.
I don't.
Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, I think I understand your question, but I don't feel like I have any clarity on determining that. And I would probably I'd probably throw my lack of clarity back to kind of a previous project. I had the really unique and complicated opportunity of interviewing Nazis, people who had been Lithuanians or Latvians who had been conscripted into things like the Polish, battalion, or battalions that enacted the Nazis' goals, we'll say, during World War II. And I'm Jewish. I'm half Jewish. My parents have an interfaith marriage. So I didn't say, hi, I'm Jewish, or I left that part out. But it was a really huge growth moment for me as a person in thinking about the complexities of identity and the complexities of how people relate to violence. Because I would almost challenge very gently your idea of combat is changing people, and say, why not violence? And to what extent does violence become is it conflict? Is it combat? Is it violence? When does violence prolonged become something? So I think my experience of having those conversations, and also at the same time interviewing people who had survived Auschwitz or Buchenwald, it was how I had to conceive of good and evil and a human's capacity for those things really morphed. And not in, and I don't want to continue with dualities, but I'm going to continue with duality, not in like a good or bad way, just in that it was like, oh yeah, everyone could do that. It's a choice is kind of where I ended up. Like they're very small circumstantial things that can change a person's willingness to, not capacity to, but willingness to engage in. And those things are often ideological. And I think they're often based on years, if not decades, of our exposure to different conditions and different belief systems.
I think one thing that we got to remember too, with at least during both of those time periods, the World War II and in the Soviet era, unlike here, these weren't volunteer forces; these were conscript forces. And not just that, if you said no, you would just disappear, and your family might disappear. Like you didn't really have an option. So it wasn't just that anyone could do this; it's like anyone would do this because there was no other option. And that's got to put a really different slant on how they kind of see what they did or look at themselves afterwards, where they can just kind of say like, well, I didn't really have a choice about it. I didn't volunteer to do this.
Yeah, there's a book about this called Battalion 101.
Yes.
It's about one of the mobile death squads. And I want to say, are they formed in 1942 maybe or 43? I can't remember which year. It was sort of mid-war. And it starts with the conscription, where let's just say you've got 100 people and you're trying to turn all of them into killers in a couple days. If people refuse, if they say no, there's no way I'm going to do this, then you offer them an office job. You're the person who supplies the ammunition for the people who are doing the killing. And then if you refuse even that, then you're in a camp as a political prisoner, or you're shot on the spot. And a lot of people go from, I can't kill my neighbors, to killing their neighbors in a matter of a couple days. Like once they've pulled the trigger for the first time, like they just sort of cross that line, and there's no coming back. It's really, really crazy book. Just, I don't know. Right. I recommend it.
I recently read it. It is very good.
Yeah.
It's about rationalization too, right? So when I look back about, Iraq, most people I think would look back at the U.S. military's role in Iraq and say maybe on false pretenses we shouldn't have gone in for those reasons. But uniformly, people from the military are proud of their experience there and their service there. How do you come to terms with those two things? And for me, you kind of skip over everything to, I find myself in a situation where my job is to protect other Marines. It's not to, shoot Iraqis. It's not to kill people. It's to make sure my fellow Marines safe. And then situations would come up where violence would be necessary to do that. So that's when you view it in that light. Yeah, we did a good job. I'm proud of my service, and I would do it again. I wouldn't change any of that. And I read some of that with the Lithuanians too. A lot of them said, I would go back. I don't regret any of it. I'm proud of everything that happened. In the paragraph before that was about genocide. I mean, it was about killing women and children. Mm-hmm. And just as an interviewer, you hear stories about what they were a part of and what they agreed to be a part of. Not that they wanted to do it, not that they were gung-ho about killing women and children, but then also finish that interview with, I would go back and I would do it again. How do you compose yourself hearing those stories, first of all? And how often did it come up and where you were shocked or surprised by what they were telling you?
I think I had really good preparation in like my experience at the PRRC and kind of starting my Eastern European interview experience with World War II traumas. So I'm not like tooting my own horn here. I wasn't ever really surprised or shocked. And so I didn't really find composure incredibly hard.
I kind of get that, actually. Yeah. I mean, if it's a professional thing, you've been doing it. Let me say this, ballpark, how many really traumatic stories had you heard from people talking up until that point? How much experience did you have before you talked to the Lithuanian soldiers?
Probably a couple years worth, like cumulatively between the VA and we'll say 6 months of doing kind of World War II traumas and Soviet like the initial Soviet reign of terror traumas, which is a lot of violence against women and violence against everyone. So when it came to the Soviet-Afghan War, in many ways, it was far more controlled. And in a one-on-one conversation, maybe perhaps credit to my interviewees, there was usually like cues that something challenging was coming or something that they perceived as challenging. And so when violence was described or complicated, difficult experiences were described, injuries, other things like that, I was never blindsided. And yeah, I think at that point is like part of my job.
Just as a practical matter, how did you interview them? Was it in English? Did you use a translator? Because that's got to be a complicating factor too.
Yep, I used a translator for everyone. At the time, this, and I like want to put the huge context that the geopolitics were quite different. I had been learning Russian because I was told if you need to learn a language, then you're going to be working in Eastern Europe. This is the most versatile. So I thought, perfect. I actually had a dual grant to be in Lithuania and Latvia. So obviously partway through that, my experience, I was like, oh, I should avoid speaking this when at all possible. But that allowed me to glean, like maybe 30 to 40% of the interview while having someone translating. So I heard everything through another person because I didn't know violence-based words or, words about anything super graphic. So I was hearing it, I guess, secondhand.
You mentioned talking to people who were victims of the Soviet. I guess you talking about the Great Purge in the late 30s when you say the terror.
Well, this would be kind of Stalin's 1950s. We'll say post World War II when the U.S. kind of deeded the Baltics.
Okay, I was thinking the earlier part, and I was, oh my God, how old are they?
Yeah.
So, first of all, what was it like talking to them? And I wonder what their general attitudes would be towards the Soviet Union if they were alive from Stalin through the death of the Soviet Union, just because it was a completely different regime every few years once Stalin died, much less violent, equally as oppressive, or maybe not even quite equally as oppressive. Anyway, did you have any insight on that?
They varied wildly, and a lot of it depended on how the experience was for their family. Because I would have been talking to people who were children or young adults during, we'll call them maybe, and perhaps this is inappropriate, I would say the worst of the Soviet experience post World War II. So Stalin, the 1950s, in Lithuania, that was a period of a lot of efforts to establish like a partisan militia that was fighting the Soviet Union, but those people often met very difficult and traumatic ends, and a lot of deportation to Siberia, to Gulag. So if your family, people close to you, or you as a child experienced that, or you were born in a Gulag, you probably have one set of perspectives. If your family was relocated to Lithuania as part of Soviet Russification, and your parents had prominent positions, maybe managers of factories, and perhaps you had a nicer space to live, or a house, or a floor in a house, you may have a very different perspective, and you may regret not having the Soviet pension you thought you would see as an adult. So I found really differing perspectives. Most of my entrance into that world was looking for trauma, essentially. So more people that I spoke to were anti-Soviet, pro-West, in many ways anti-Russia, or critical of Russia's media. However, in the day-to-day world, and often people would say, oh, well, but like my neighbor, it would be someone of the other perspective, differing than theirs. So I began to really quickly understand that nothing was like black and white, and nuance was pretty much everywhere, just based on how complicated the Soviet occupation was, with forced relocations, forced deportation, Russification, and lots of different layers where some people experienced advantages. A number of people I interviewed missed the Soviet Union. And many of them, it was because, I would say broad brush, they were relocated to Lithuania as part of efforts to Russify. And so their families had, prominent positions. And when the Soviet Union dissolved, they lost those positions, and things that they anticipated getting based on status or based on the fact that they were Russian instead of Lithuanian no longer existed.
Let me understand that a little bit. So some of the veterans that you interviewed, their family would have been born and raised in Russia, but they were moved to Lithuania. So how do they consider themselves? Do they consider themselves primarily Lithuanian, or is it more complicated than that?
I can think of 3 in the book very specifically. 2 were born in Russia. Their parents were military, and so they ended up being relocated to Lithuania in efforts to, within an occupation, you move high-ranking military officials around to kind of continue order or to train. And so then they joined the military as young people and grew up being quite advantaged based on kind of their fact that they were Russian, the fact that their parents were prominent within the Soviet military or prominent in Soviet society. Another person who is pro-Russian, who is not overtly pro-Russian in the book, was actually, and this is where things get even more complicated, was actually born in Ukraine and relocated to Lithuania, but probably for a variety of complicated reasons. Again, like layers and layers of nuance. Believed in, or continues to believe in, the Soviet system and believes in kind of Russia's adaptation of the Soviet system. And so I hope I've answered your question.
No, you did. I think that it's so much more complex than I think Americans appreciate from the old Soviet countries that are now independent countries, and how it was all mixed up. And you don't go from, okay, now we're Lithuanians and we're pro-US and everything's good. I read in the book, there was some policy changes where Lithuanian veterans can't wear their uniforms anymore because it would be Russian propaganda that by law would be banned. So they can't have parades or anything like that. But you said something that generated a question, that you have pro-Russian, I don't know about openly pro-Russian, but pro-Russian veterans. And the way that you made contact with these vets was the same Veterans Association.
Yes.
Did you see any conflict within the association, or does that all kind of strip away and they all are just happy to have this association where it seems like it's about the only piece of recognition they get for their service?
That answer has evolved. So in 2014 and 2015, and I was there in 2016 and 2017, so we'll say prior to the full-scale invasion, there was a relative peace amongst the veterans, regardless of perspective. In some ways, and I don't want to get political, but we might think in the US about how Democrats and Republicans used to be able to sit down and have conversations and disagree. But today that feels impossible if you're Democrat or pro-Trump or pro-Harris, pro-Trump. That there's suddenly a space where there's like no room for discourse. I would say, so I was in Lithuania in May. They have crossed into a space where there is no room for discourse based on about Russia and Russia's aggression in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. I was very glad to see everyone at once, everyone gathered together, but the majority of my contacts, anyone who I've kept in touch with for the last 10 years, is pro-Ukraine. And those people have been very open with me about how challenging it has been, how it has changed the dynamic of the group. It's changed the type of things that they get involved with. It's changed quite a bit. They no longer have like a clubhouse where they meet. They have a ban on talking about politics so that they don't totally lose out on the ability to get together and have kind of supportive dialogic spaces about the war in Afghanistan. And so it has absolutely impacted their current state and the way that they relate to each other.
This is kind of a weird analogy, but there's a thing in kind of my world when parents get divorced, it's always discouraged for the parents to ever like talk negatively about the other parent around the kid, because it creates this cognitive dissonance where the kid may know what the one is saying is correct, but their gut reaction is to defend the parent that's being talked shit on at that moment. And so like, I can only imagine this on a much more broad scale with these people where they've been kind of pulled back and forth from like one, center of the world to the other. And like who do they really feel like or that they should be defending, and who do they really feel like internally, and how that must impact them.
I think so, and I think that's probably a really fair analogy. And I think an additional layer that complicates it is the history of surveillance that comes with the Soviet Union, and the history of kind of not talking about difficult things in public, or being very careful about how you're sharing information. Because I don't know, funny is totally inappropriate, but I had kind of bizarre experiences a number of times where I would be this was in May, having a conversation about some of these things with Lithuanians, pro-Ukrainian Lithuanians, and they would say, we would be sitting somewhere and they would say, we should walk, because they didn't even want these conversations to happen in one static place. They wanted them to happen over a series of blocks or around a park. And so I think the history that's baked into their relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union, and I'm not saying they're the same thing, but with, we'll say, the Soviet Union and maybe the Kremlin, is to be very skeptical and very concerned about surveillance. And so it's just an additional layer of like, we don't want to talk shit about the other parent, but also we're like deeply concerned about the other parent and what are they doing, and are they listening, and where are they, and who are their friends, and how close are their friends. And so that made it additionally very, very interesting.
The project that you mentioned working on earlier with the Polish Baltic survivors of the end of World War II, maybe young conscripts into the German military, and then people who suffered afterwards. What ended up coming of that? Is there any way for us to read the output?
So sadly, that's from the time when I was really just an artist.
Wow.
I made photographs. I did conduct interviews, but all of the interviews were turned over. So it's like a sidebar. Lithuania has a national Holocaust museum that is, I would say, deeply underfunded, based on the, again, complicated relationship between Lithuanian nationals and the Holocaust history.
Oh, right.
And their perception that Jewish people were pro-Soviet, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the Soviets were getting rid of the Nazis. Yeah, so very complicated. So I did a lot of interviews, but I turned everything over to them as a, like, you need this oral history. I want you to do with this what you feel is appropriate. So you would have to go to Lithuania for that.
The Lithuanian Holocaust Museum, no less.
This episode brought to you by the Lithuanian Travel Bureau. Now, the trauma that these soldiers experienced, regardless of the geopolitics and why they were there and who ordered them there and what they did, a lot of them clearly from the book had some traumatic things that the general public would consider traumatic. They had this association, which is, how do I say it, self-organized. It's not government related or anything like that. What do they have outside of the organization for support?
Very little. And if you ask them, essentially nothing. Coming home, they had nothing. That's how many of them described it. That basically you couldn't seek mental health resources, or you would be deemed crazy and just kind of assigned the role that, like, you belong in an asylum. If you aren't okay following this experience, it's a you problem in a contemporary context. So 40 years of evolution for some, between 30 and 40 years. There's obviously a healthier discourse around mental health in Lithuania, but there are, for all practical purposes, no special opportunities, because the government that they fought for doesn't exist and is considered the enemy in Lithuania. There is no social system designed to support them. There's been some small amount of legislation passed. I think it was 2017, that granted them things like free bus trips. And I think they got, this could be incorrect, my recollection is they got like a number of trips to basically like a health spa, which is something, but that's not formal mental health. That's not working with a mental health professional that can help you process difficult things in a healthy way. So very little.
How have these experiences, both your initial experience and the experience of composing and writing I Try Not to Think of Afghanistan, changed you as an artist and a writer? What's the impact been for you professionally?
What I tend to tell the group when I see them is their willingness to work with me and take me seriously made my career. Had they not, chosen to I would think I was 26 when I started working with them, and I worked for them for like 3 years. Had they not chosen to take me seriously and to trust me with their stories, the capacity to share them fairly and with equity, had they not had that faith in me, I don't know how my career would have evolved. And so I credit them every time I see them. Your faith in me, your trust in me was instrumental in kind of establishing my career. As far as an individual, I can give a really mushy, soft answer and just say that when people you don't know in another country who owe you nothing choose to take a chance on you and give you their time to share some really dark personal things, it definitely, there's an element to that's like restorative in terms of how I view humanity, I think, even though we're talking about really difficult, violent, sometimes like war crimes. That is a really unique experience, and I have nothing but gratitude to them for affording me that.
It's interesting when you talked about the teaching you've done and your work before that you seem to describe yourself more as an artist than, say, a journalist. Is that correct?
That is correct.
The reason I find that interesting is just with, writing these types of stories and interviewing types of people with journalism, there's usually this expectation of kind of neutrality and where you're not getting involved in the stories at all, where you're kind of a just observer. But as an artist, I can't imagine you can do that at all. How did you find that? Did you find that in conflict as you did this, or did it make the writing more personal to come from an artist standpoint?
That is a really complicated question. In like the weeds of photography, photojournalism, and documentary work, I see myself as like someone who does documentary photography. And the way that I define that in the context of journalism is journalism has a goal of like dissemination in my mind. Like the goal is to get something to share. And I often view journalism as something that should be conclusive or have that framework that I think Adrian was talking about. So when I set out to do this project, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just wanted to talk to people who all had this shared experience of going to Afghanistan as Soviet conscripts. And I used a methodical process. These are the questions. I want to meet you at your house or your workplace. Like, I would like it to be somewhere you're comfortable, not like random public bench. But I wanted the process to be what guided it and it to be a space for these conversations. Because the grant that I did this on was called Artist as Activist. And so a huge component of it was the activism component. So I tried to not set up like a take. I tried to have a give-take where in this process, there's space for them to talk about, or for me to share things I learned at the PRRC, for me to share things I learned about coping and healing, some of that training. So it wasn't just me coming in and saying, describe this, answer these questions. We'll have a nice, these are often like 3 or 4 hour meetings. And then I go on my way, but it was something where I was present and trying to, maybe this is overly optimistic, but like offer a service or offer something in return. And that's where I see, and that's not to say that journalists don't do that. I'm sure many do, but I saw it as being a balanced interaction that was two-way, not one-way. And that's where I felt like being in the art world and being part of kind of a social artistic practice that was about this engagement or dual engagement is how I approach like all of my work.
Well, I got to say the final product is fantastic, because when you hear stories about vets, it's and someone that considers themselves a writer, author, maybe a novelist, tries to put that to paper, it ends up being like a linear story. I wouldn't say to fill pages. They're very good writers doing these books and things. Hey, present company excluded. This is fantastic stuff. Satire is different. Anyway, but you didn't approach it that way. You approached it with photographs and let them tell their story, and it reads like how vets would want to hear the story and how vets would tell the story, which is I like about it. It's vignettes is not the right word because they're not super short or anything like that, but like little clips, and how vets are very direct. And this is how I started, and this was my experience, and it is yet still engaging. So it's definitely something I think if you're if you're a military veteran, U.S. veteran, it's a unique perspective and definitely worth checking out.
Not only that, I would add that it's not that it codes as authentic, because the thing that the book that anytime you're talking about Soviet veterans of Afghanistan, of course you have to think the casual reader is going to think about Svetlana Alexievich and her capturing the Zinky boys, the people who are coming back in these zinc coffins. And that, as we've learned, Svetlana Alexievich, one of the great writers alive today, and I don't mean anything disparaging about her when I say this, but she is not telling veteran stories. She's telling a story, and she's using veteran voices to do that, to honor them, no question. But that's not what this is at all. And I want to draw a little bit of a distinction there, because this is the veterans. These are the veterans' faces. These are the veterans' voices. Very different type of project than what Alexievich is doing, and as important.
Thank you so much. I think, so coming from an art world, a common question is, okay, who is your audience? Like, who are you making this for? My goal was, when I knew, okay, it's going to be a book, this is what it's going to be. Like, my goal was to serve that veterans group and make sure that they felt like it was authentic to them. It was exhibited as a photo series in conjunction with work that I did with U.S. soldiers pre-deployment. That was a very different style of project. And it was really wonderful that at the opening, this happened in Iowa, because I'm based in South Dakota, a large number of U.S. Army veterans who had multiple deployments and been part of actually Iowa's National Guard that just was like in heavy rotation for the first few years of the U.S.'s involvement in the Middle East. They came, and it was like I got to repeat this idea of like a dialogic space where it was a space for conversation and for people to kind of claim their space, their stories, their narrative in a public forum. And that's really all that I wanted, because I do think space to be heard and seen is so important. And that was really my goal. So it's really wonderful to hear such kind things from both of you.
Well, it's the goal of this podcast too, the voices that sometimes don't get heard. So thank you.
One other thing that I think is so funny, I don't remember exactly how we crossed paths, but you and I both went to a post-Soviet state with the goal of tracking down specifically veteran groups from Afghanistan. And it was so interesting to me to revisit your introduction before the podcast today, because you lay out the questions that you ask too. So you sort of establish your methodology. And I was thinking about how careful you were in designing this project. However it ended up coming out, there was a kind of care that you took in approaching it and approaching the group and the subjects. And my intro was, I read a series of articles in the New York Times, and it was just one photo. So here's the power that speaks to the power of photojournalism. A photo for a Chris Chivers story in the New York Times about how Ukrainian veterans of the Red Army's invasion of Afghanistan, they call them Afghantsi there. I don't know if it's a similar term in Lithuania or in Russia, but the Afghantsi, and they're these sort of like older guys who are kitted out with, these like very old 1980s style load bearing equipment and walkie-talkies, and they're helping the people on Euromaidan. And they're like living out that fantasy I think the Vietnam veterans of America have always had, which is they get to be the good guy. And so I went there thinking to myself, similarly, I think probably in the back of my head, I had maybe a project like your book, I was going to get in these groups and I was going to talk to them, and we were going to be friends because I'd been in Afghanistan and they'd been in Afghanistan, and I'd been in Organy and Paktika and I'd been in Kunduz, and so would they. We were going to swap stories. And I got there, I talked to two groups, and both of them thought I was CIA from the jump. And neither of them gave me the time of day. They wanted money from me because they thought I was there to help them. And I was like, God, I would love to help you guys. I agree with your project, but I'm actually just a journalist. I can't help. And they had better stuff to do. So I found my way to the East. But seeing your book and your methodology and your way of approaching it, it's really, really interesting. And it's probably true that the that design that you had in the beginning, your experience talking to other people and your approach did actually help you succeed where I unfortunately was not able to succeed with the Afghantsi. Still have never cracked into a Ukrainian Afghantsi group. Gun shy now, I suppose.
I know some people who could help you.
Yeah. Well, tell them I'm not from the CIA.
I hesitate to say this in any context, but I'd say especially when I'm conscious that I'm talking to 4 guys, but I have no doubt that being a woman in that dynamic made access easier in some ways, because there's an automatic different set of expectations. So I'm sure that changed things for me.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually, that leads to an interesting follow-up, which I think you talk about a little bit in the book, and we may have talked around a little bit earlier, which is just that I know Ukraine is a pretty patriarchal society, and that's one of the things that Euromaidan has been attempting to change, move culture toward a more Western, more open, more egalitarian and meritocratic style society. Is that something similar with Lithuania? And I know, caveating that with like knowing the U.S. I was Army infantry, so Army infantry is about as patriarchal and hierarchical and kind of chauvinistic a place as you'll find in America. I'm guessing it was maybe like that as well with this, or
I'm going to give a 2-part answer to that. Yes, it is a patriarchal society, and there are numerous growth areas. I think that as a country, socially and culturally, many people are aware that they have, and some people are probably a little bit recalcitrant and aren't interested in changing. However, and this is the second part, I never felt compromised or disrespected by anyone in that organization, individually or when they were together as a group. And so, I've said this to students, I've said this in other presentation or interview settings, like I've had a far more challenging time at faculty meetings, being gendered in unuseful ways, or being, having behaviors or emotions or things assigned to me or abilities assigned to me based on gender than I ever experienced working with any Lithuanian veterans. So I do socially, there's definitely growth areas in their country, but I want to give credit where credit is definitely due. I felt very respected, and I never felt as though I was looked down on or perceived as in some way like inept, or like, why are you as a woman doing this? So I definitely owe them. I cannot answer that question without giving them that credit.
Anna, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. This has been incredibly informative. I highly recommend, especially any veteran, to check out I Try Not to Think of Afghanistan. You can find it online. I think I got it from Amazon, and definitely worth the read. So thanks again. Thank
you all so much for having me.
If you can buy it from directly from Cornell University Press. I think that's what Northern Illinois University Press, which is an imprint of Cornell. I got it from Cornell. It might cost you a little bit more, but it doesn't feed the beast.
Oh, great point. Thank you. All right. Anything else? Anything anybody needs to plug? Ryan, you got anything you need to plug?
Nothing I haven't plugged before. We're good.
Okay. Can I say that if you want a palate cleanser and you want to laugh a little bit more than this,
slightly,
in this episode, check out Connor versus Cobb. Can I plug that?
Yeah, absolutely. And
it's fantastic. I just listened to it.
Thank you for plugging Connor versus Cobb, my new podcast. Let's also put the special in the book out there.
Okay, there you go. Rip the Band-Aid off.
The novel, The Party, and the special is live from DC. If you Google them, you'll find them.
All good stuff. We've all seen and read. All right, everybody. Thanks, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, Anna.
Thank you, Anna. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Music for Baggage provided by Quincy Ledbetter. You can find his stuff at qledbetter.com. Graphics provided by Megan Weaver. You can find her at meganweaverart.com. Special thanks to our premium members for their support. You can become a premium member by clicking subscribe in your Apple Podcast app or by visiting thebaggagepodcast.com/support to sign up or to gift a membership to someone. A percentage of all proceeds go to charity. If you have any questions, comments, or a good story to share, please email us at thebaggagepodcast@gmail.com.